The hardest truth I ever learned is that being right means nothing if people are not ready to hear it. I have stood before crowds who called me a troublemaker, a communist, an enemy of peace. I have watched men who considered themselves decent turn away rather than face what I was saying. For years I spoke the same message. The words did not change. What changed was America's willingness to finally listen. People imagine moral progress happens through grand revelations. It does not. It happens when enough pain accumulates that denial becomes more costly than admission. When a nation sees its own reflection and cannot look away. When children ask questions their parents can no longer answer with comfortable lies. I did not convince America I was right. America convinced itself. I simply refused to stop speaking while it did. Before we continue, take a moment to notice where you're listening from, and if this story stays with you, you are welcome to return tomorrow for what comes next. I came to Montgomery believing I understood how change happened. I had studied Hegel's dialectics at Boston University, read Reinhold Niebuhr's warnings about moral complacency, absorbed Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance. I carried my leather Bible everywhere, its margins filled with notes connecting scripture to the struggles I saw around me. That Bible was more than a book. It was my credential, my shield, my proof that what I spoke came from something larger than personal grievance. When the Montgomery Improvement Association chose me to lead the bus boycott in December 1955, I was 26 years old. I had been in the city barely a year, pastoring at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. I was young enough to believe that education and eloquence could penetrate any heart, that a well-reasoned argument delivered with enough conviction would force even the most resistant listener to acknowledge truth. My father had been a preacher. His father before him. I grew up watching my father navigate the careful politics of black leadership in Atlanta, speaking forcefully enough to maintain respect within our community while avoiding the kind of confrontation that could get a man killed. He taught me that moral authority came from the pulpit, that a minister's voice carried weight that ordinary protests could not match. I believed him. I believe that America, despite its sins, was fundamentally a Christian nation. That meant its citizens, however misguided, could be reached through appeals to their stated values. The contradiction between democratic ideals and racial oppression was so glaring, so obvious, that surely once it was properly articulated, decent people would have to respond. The boycott began as a single-day protest. We expected it to last perhaps a week, maybe two. The women who organized it, Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council, had been planning for months, waiting for the right moment. When Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat, we had our moment. I wrote my first speech for the mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church in less than 20 minutes. I had no time to prepare properly. No carefully crafted rhetoric. I stood before thousands of people packed into that church and spilling onto the streets outside, and I spoke from what I knew. I talked about justice and dignity. I quoted the Constitution and the Bible in the same breath. I reminded them that we were Americans, that this country's founding documents promised equality, that our cause was not radical but conservative, calling America back to its own principles. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People wept. They shouted agreement. They committed to walking rather than riding segregated buses for as long as it took. In that moment, I thought I had found the key. Speak to their better nature. Frame our demands in language they already claimed to believe. Show them the contradiction, and they would have to choose the right side. I was wrong about the timeline. The boycott did not last days or weeks. It lasted 381 days, more than a year of walking, of organizing carpools, of negotiating with city officials who saw us as children throwing a tantrum rather than citizens making a legitimate demand. More than a year of watching people I respected, people with power and education, find increasingly creative ways to avoid admitting what they knew to be true. The white ministers of Montgomery troubled me most. These were men who read the same scripture I did, who preached about love and justice every Sunday. When we reached out to them, asking them to support our cause, or at least to acknowledge its moral legitimacy, most refused, not with hostility, but with something worse, a kind of sympathetic dismissal. They agreed that segregation was unfortunate. They wished us well in our gradual progress toward equality, but they could not support our methods. We were moving too fast. We were being unreasonable. We were jeopardizing the slow, steady improvement that patient negotiation would bring. I learned during those months that being right is not enough. I learned that moral clarity, scriptural authority, logical argument, none of these guarantee a hearing. What they guarantee is a response, and that response is usually not agreement but deflection. The city fought us with legal maneuvers. They arrested carpoolers for operating unlicensed taxis. They indicted boycott leaders under an old anti-boycott law. They spread rumors that we were communist agitators, outside troublemakers stirring up previously content Negroes. My house was bombed in January 1956. My wife Coretta was home with our infant daughter. They were not hurt, but the message was clear. This was not a debate, this was a war. And still I believed in the power of moral persuasion. I told myself that the resistance was temporary, that once the Supreme Court ruled in our favor, as it eventually did, the opposition would subside, the law would change, and hearts would follow. I was wrong about that too. What I did not yet understand, what I would spend years coming to terms with, was that America's resistance to racial equality was not primarily intellectual. It was not a matter of insufficient information or poor reasoning. It was psychological, economic, and social. It was built into the structure of how white Americans understood themselves, their history, their deserved place in the world. You cannot argue someone out of a worldview that protects their material interest and psychological comfort. You cannot shame them into abandoning beliefs that make their own advantages feel earned rather than inherited. What you can do is make the cost of maintaining those beliefs higher than the cost of letting them go. But I did not know that yet. In Montgomery, I still believe that truth spoken clearly enough, persistently enough, would be its own sufficient force. I believe that America was better than its current behavior, that it was waiting to be called to its higher self. I see now that I was half right. America did have a higher self, principles it genuinely claimed to believe, but claiming and acting are different things, and the distance between them is filled with fear, self-interest, and the deep human capacity for self-deception. The boycott ended in victory. The Supreme Court ruled segregated buses unconstitutional. We rode integrated buses in December 1956. We celebrated. We believed we had proven the method worked. Nonviolent resistance, moral witness, persistent pressure, these things could force change, and they could. But not the way I thought, not through conversion, but through crisis. Not by winning hearts, but by making the old way untenable. I would learn this slowly, painfully, through Birmingham and Selma and Memphis, through watching moderate white clergy publish letters condemning not segregation but our timing, through seeing politicians who privately agreed with us publicly denounce our methods, through realizing that people who consider themselves decent can witness injustice daily and find perfectly logical reasons why addressing it must wait. The artifact I carried through all of it, that worn leather Bible with its ink-marked margins, became something different over time. In Montgomery, it was proof of my moral authority. By Memphis, it was a reminder that righteousness without power is theatrical, and that prophets are honored most reliably after they are dead. But I am getting ahead of myself. In Montgomery, I was still young enough to believe that being right mattered most, that truth would prevail because it was true, that America's better angels were just waiting to be invoked. I would spend the rest of my life learning why that was both true and completely insufficient. The letter arrived in April 1963, slipped under my cell door in Birmingham jail. 8 white clergymen, moderate voices in Alabama's religious community, had published a statement calling our demonstrations unwise and untimely. They did not defend segregation. They simply argued that we should wait, that change should come through courts and negotiation rather than direct action, that our presence in Birmingham was creating unnecessary tension. I had been arrested on Good Friday for violating an injunction against protest. The jail cell was narrow and cold. I had no writing paper, so I started my response in the margins of the newspaper that contained their statement, then continued on scraps of paper smuggled in by my lawyer. That letter, which would later be called the letter from Birmingham jail, became one of my most widely read pieces of writing. But what mattered to me then, sitting in that cell, was not the letter's eventual impact. What mattered was the depth of my frustration with men I had expected to understand. These were not Klansmen. They were educated clergy who preached the gospel I preach. They acknowledged that segregation was wrong, and yet they opposed what we were doing, not because they disagreed with our goals, but because they found our methods inconvenient. We were disturbing the peace. We were provoking violence by insisting on our rights. We should trust the legal system and wait for the right time. I wrote in that letter something I had been learning for years but had never articulated so clearly. The great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. That realization had come slowly. In Montgomery, I had still believed that moderates were allies who simply needed education. By Albany in 1962, where we had failed to achieve meaningful change despite months of protest, I was beginning to understand that moderation was often indistinguishable from opposition. And in Birmingham, facing not just Bull Connor's fire hoses and police dogs, but also the carefully worded disapproval of respectable clergymen, I finally grasped the full scope of the problem. America did not need to be convinced that segregation was wrong. Most Americans already knew that, at least abstractly. What they needed was to be forced to choose between their comfort and their principles. And that required creating crisis, not avoiding it. We had chosen Birmingham deliberately. The city was one of the most segregated in America. Its public safety commissioner, Bull Connor, was known for his volatile temperament and willingness to use violence against civil rights protesters. We knew that if we pushed hard enough, Connor would overreact. And we knew that images of that overreaction broadcast on national television would force people who preferred not to think about segregation to witness its brutality. This was a calculated strategy. We were not seeking violence, but we were no longer avoiding situations where violence might occur. We were forcing America to see what it had been content to ignore. The question was whether seeing would be enough. The Children's March was the turning point. On May 2, we sent hundreds of black school children into the streets to march peacefully toward downtown Birmingham. They sang, they carried signs, they walked in orderly lines. Bull Connor met them with fire hoses powerful enough to strip bark from trees, with police dogs, with mass arrests. Children as young as 6 were hauled to jail in paddy wagons. The photographs went everywhere. Children slammed against walls by water pressure. Teenagers bitten by German shepherds. Young faces behind bars still singing freedom songs. America watched it during dinner. They saw it in morning newspapers. They could not look away and they could not explain it away. I watched from jail, receiving reports from my colleagues. I felt the terrible weight of responsibility for putting those children in danger. I also felt something else, a grim recognition that this was what it took. Not speeches, not legal briefs, not appeals to conscience. Images of children being brutalized for asking to be treated as human beings. The business community broke first. Downtown merchants losing money as the protests shut down shopping districts, pressured city officials to negotiate. They did not suddenly develop moral clarity about segregation. They simply decided that maintaining it was too expensive. Within weeks, we had an agreement. Lunch counters would be desegregated. Hiring practices would change. The movement claimed victory, but I knew what kind of victory it was. We had not changed minds. We had changed the cost-benefit analysis. Birmingham's white leadership chose integration not because they believed in equality, but because they believed in profit more than they believed in segregation. The moral argument had mattered less than the economic disruption. This troubled me deeply. I had been raised to believe that moral witness was an end in itself, that speaking truth to power mattered regardless of immediate results. My theological training emphasized a prophetic tradition, standing for righteousness even in the face of certain defeat. But I was learning that prophecy without strategy was self-indulgent, that being right while remaining powerless helped no one. The contradiction was painful. I believed in the absolute moral truth of our cause. I also recognized that moral truth alone would not feed hungry children or protect families from violence. We needed power, leverage, the ability to make resisting us more costly than accepting our demand. That meant sometimes manipulating situations to create crisis, calculating which actions would generate the most useful media coverage, choosing targets not because they were the most evil, but because they were the most vulnerable to pressure. This was not the ministry I had imagined. It was political organizing, wrapped in theological language. It required a kind of cold-blooded assessment of tactics that sat uncomfortably alongside the love ethic I preached. I had to learn to be both prophet and pragmatist, to speak absolute truths while making relative calculations, to lead a moral movement through deeply immoral means. The FBI noticed J. Edgar Hoover had been monitoring me since Montgomery, but after Birmingham, the surveillance intensified. They tapped my phones. They bugged hotel rooms. They collected information about my personal life, my associations, my private conversations. Hoover believed I was either a communist or a dangerous demagogue, possibly both. He could not understand that I was simply someone trying to force America to live up to its stated values using the only methods that seemed to work. Later that summer, we organized the March on Washington. 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. I gave the speech that would become my most famous, the one everyone remembers. I have a dream. The soaring rhetoric about children of different races playing together, about justice rolling down like waters. It was genuine. I meant every word. But I also knew, even as I spoke those words, that dreams do not change laws. The march was theater, necessary and powerful theater, but theater nonetheless. We had calculated that a massive, peaceful demonstration would build political pressure for the civil rights legislation we needed. We were using the language of dreams to pursue concrete policy changes. The dream mattered because it could be televised, because it could move politicians who needed to appeal to voters increasingly uncomfortable with racial violence. President Kennedy met with civil rights leaders after the march. He was sympathetic but cautious. He worried about Southern Democrats, about losing votes, about moving too fast. He promised to support civil rights legislation while making it clear that political reality required patience. He was not evil. He was not even particularly resistant. He simply placed political calculation above moral urgency, as politicians do. 3 months later, he was dead. I mourned him genuinely, even as I recognized that his assassination, terrible as it was, might advance our cause. Lyndon Johnson, his successor, had political skills Kennedy lacked and fewer illusions about Southern moderates. Johnson understood power in ways that Kennedy never had. He knew how to threaten, cajole, and trade favors. He could be useful. I was becoming someone I had not expected to be. Still a minister, still committed to nonviolence, still believing in the moral rightness of our cause, but also calculating, strategic, willing to use whatever tools worked. The leather Bible still went everywhere with me, but alongside it, I now carried political assessments, media strategies, tactical plans for creating maximum disruption with minimum violence. The question was whether this transformation made me more effective or simply more compromised, whether I was leading a movement toward justice or just becoming another political operator using moral language for practical ends. I did not have an answer then. I am not certain I have one now. What I knew was that being right had never been enough. It had never been close to enough. And if forcing America to acknowledge that rightness required methods that troubled my conscience, that seemed to be the price of actually accomplishing something rather than just feeling righteous about inevitable failure. The Civil Rights Act passed in July 1964. It was the most comprehensive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It banned discrimination in public accommodations, in employment, in federally funded programs. On paper, it dismantled the legal architecture of segregation. President Johnson signed it with great ceremony, handing out pens to civil rights leaders who had fought for it. I should have felt triumphant. We had achieved something that seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The law now said that segregation was illegal, that discrimination was prohibited, that equal access was required. This was what we had marched for, what we had been beaten for, what some had died for. Instead, I felt a strange emptiness. The law had changed. The question was whether anything else would. I traveled to Selma, Alabama in early 1965. The city had become our next target because despite the new laws, black citizens there still could not vote. The registration process was deliberately designed to exclude them. Impossible literacy tests, limited registration hours, arbitrary rejections. In a county where black residents were the majority, only 2% were registered voters. Voting rights were different from lunch counter integration. You could force a restaurant to serve black customers by making the alternative too expensive. But voting required active participation from the very people who had spent centuries preventing it. It required local registrars to fairly administer tests they had been using to exclude. It required white poll workers to process applications they had always rejected. It required a fundamental shift in who held power, not just who could sit where. The resistance in Selma was immediate and brutal. Sheriff Jim Clark met our peaceful marchers with billy clubs and cattle prods. On March 7, a day that would be called Bloody Sunday, 600 marchers attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge were attacked by state troopers and deputies. They used tear gas, whips, and clubs against unarmed people walking peacefully. John Lewis, one of our youngest leaders, had his skull fractured. Again, the cameras captured everything. Again, America watched during dinner. Again, the images forced a reckoning that words alone could never achieve. And again, I felt the terrible moral weight of knowing that we had planned for exactly this response, that we had chosen Selma precisely because we knew Jim Clark would react with violence, that we had put people in harm's way as a calculated strategy. The white clergy came to Selma after Bloody Sunday, ministers and rabbis from across the country, responding to our call for religious leaders to stand with us. One of them, James Reed, a white Unitarian minister from Boston, was beaten to death by segregationists. His murder drew national attention in ways that the deaths of black activists had not. This was another bitter lesson. America mourned a white minister more than it had mourned Jimmy Lee Jackson, the black man whose death had prompted the march in the first place. I spoke at Reeves' memorial service. I talked about his sacrifice, his courage, his commitment to justice. I meant it all. I also knew that his death mattered politically in ways that Jackson's had not, that white grief carried more weight than black grief, that this was simply the reality we had to work with. President Johnson addressed Congress and the nation. He spoke about voting rights with genuine passion. He invoked the movement's language, saying, "We shall overcome," in a televised speech. It was a remarkable moment. The President of the United States adopting the words of a protest movement. The Voting Rights Act passed in August 1965, but something had shifted in me by then. I had spent a decade watching America respond not to moral arguments, but to crisis. Not to appeals to conscience, but to political pressure, not to the rightness of our cause, but to the cost of opposing it. And I was beginning to understand that the changes we had achieved, real as they were, had not touched the deeper problem. Segregation was a symptom. The disease was economic inequality built on centuries of exploitation. We had won the right to sit at lunch counters, but many of us could not afford to buy lunch. We had won the right to vote, but our communities still lacked jobs, housing, quality schools, basic services. The legal barriers were falling, but the material conditions that made segregation possible remained untouched. I started talking about poverty and economic justice. I argued that civil rights without economic opportunity was hollow. I began to see connections between racial oppression in America and exploitation in other countries. I spoke against the Vietnam War, arguing that a nation spending billions to bomb Vietnamese peasants while its own citizens lived in poverty had fundamentally disordered priorities. This did not go over well. My traditional allies warned me that I was overreaching, that I should stay focused on civil rights rather than wade into economic and foreign policy debates. The Johnson administration, which had supported voting rights legislation, turned hostile when I criticized the war. Fellow civil rights leaders told me I was jeopardizing our gains by alienating white moderates who had supported us. But I had learned something by then. White moderates had never supported us out of moral conviction. They had supported us when the cost of opposition became too high, when images of children being attacked with fire hoses made their moral indifference untenable, when the combination of moral witness and political pressure made supporting us easier than continuing to resist. Economic justice would be harder. You could pass a law saying restaurants must serve everyone. You could not pass a law creating jobs or building decent housing or funding quality schools in poor communities. Those things required redistributing resources from people who had them to people who did not. They required white Americans to accept that their prosperity was built partly on black poverty, that addressing racial inequality meant accepting less for themselves. I did not think they would do that voluntarily. I had watched them resist much smaller changes. I had seen how they turned on us the moment we moved from demanding access to demanding actual equality. The same moderate voices that had eventually supported integration became harsh critics when we talked about economic redistribution. The Poor People's Campaign was my attempt to address this. We would bring poor people from across America, black and white and Latino and Native American, to Washington to demand economic justice. We would camp on the National Mall until the government addressed poverty with the same urgency it brought to foreign conflicts. We would force America to confront not just legal segregation, but economic inequality. I knew it was risky. The coalition was fragile. Many white poor people had been taught that black people were their competitors rather than their allies. Getting them to work together required overcoming generations of manipulation. The goals were vague because economic justice is harder to define than the right to vote. And I was exhausted, increasingly aware that the movement was fragmenting, that younger activists saw nonviolence as insufficient, that even allies questioned whether I had become too radical or not radical enough. My wife, Coretta, worried. My children barely knew me. I traveled constantly speaking and organizing and raising money. The FBI surveillance had intensified to the point of harassment. They sent me anonymous letters suggesting I should kill myself. They leaked information about my personal life, trying to destroy my reputation and undermine the movement. J. Edgar Hoover called me the most dangerous man in America. I found that grimly funny. The most dangerous man in America was someone asking that poor people have enough to eat, that workers earn living wages, that the nation stop dropping bombs on Asian villages. If that was dangerous, what did that say about America? But I understood the threat I represented. As long as I focused on legal segregation, I was manageable. Uncomfortable, but manageable. White moderates could support that without examining their own advantages. They could feel good about backing integration while maintaining the economic structures that kept most black Americans poor. When I started connecting racism to capitalism, when I argued that meaningful equality required economic redistribution, when I suggested that America's foreign policy and domestic inequality were related symptoms of the same moral sickness, I became genuinely threatening. I was no longer asking America to live up to its stated ideals. I was questioning whether those ideals were sufficient, whether the nation built on exploitation could achieve justice without fundamental transformation. This was not the message that had made me famous. The Dream speech was about inclusion, about joining the American experiment, about believing that the nation's promise could be extended to everyone. This new message suggested that the experiment itself might be flawed, that you could not build a just society on an unjust foundation, that real change required more than legal reform. I did not have answers for how to achieve this transformation. I knew nonviolence was not enough. I also knew that violence would destroy us. I believed in America's capacity for change because I had seen it change. I also believed that change had come not from moral growth, but from political necessity, and that Americans would fight much harder to protect their economic advantages than they had fought to maintain segregated lunch counters. In Memphis, in April 1968, I was supporting striking sanitation workers. They were demanding recognition of their union, better wages, and basic dignity. The city refused to negotiate seriously. The workers, almost all black men, carried signs that said simply, "I am a man." They were asking for the most basic acknowledgement of their humanity and being told no. I gave a speech at Mason Temple the night before I died. I talked about threats against my life. I said I did not know what would happen, that we had difficult days ahead. I also said I had been to the mountaintop, that I had seen the promised land, that we as a people would get there even if I did not make it with them. People remember that speech as prophetic. I remember feeling very tired, aware that I had given everything I had and it was not enough, that America had changed and not changed, that we had won important victories that left the fundamental problem untouched. I believed America would eventually realize I was right about segregation. I was less certain it would ever accept that I was right about economic justice. Being right about inclusion was one thing. Being right about redistribution was something else entirely. The bullet came on the 4th of April, 1968. I was standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, talking with colleagues about dinner plans. A single shot from a boarding house across the street. I died at the hospital an hour later. I was 39 years old. But this is not a story about my death. It is a story about when America realized I was right, and that realization did not come at the moment of my assassination. It came slowly, incompletely, in ways I could not have predicted. The immediate response to my murder was riots. Over 100 cities erupted in violence, buildings burned, people died. The rage that I had spent my life channeling into nonviolent resistance exploded across America in exactly the way I had warned it would if peaceful change remained impossible. President Johnson called for calm. He pushed through the Fair Housing Act, the last major civil rights legislation of the era, as a memorial to my work. But the riots were not about honoring me. They were about the frustration I had been trying to articulate, the recognition that legal equality without economic opportunity was insufficient, that America had given us rights while maintaining the conditions that made those rights largely symbolic. The people burning cities were not rejecting my message. They were expressing the rage I had felt, but tried to transform into something constructive. In the weeks after my death, I became someone I had never been in life. I became safe. My speeches were quoted selectively. The parts about love and dreams and nonviolence, stripped of the economic critique and the anger and the increasingly radical analysis of American capitalism. I became the acceptable face of civil rights, a man who had a dream, the prophet of racial harmony. This bothered my closest colleagues. They knew that I had become deeply critical of American society in my final years, that I saw racism and poverty and militarism as interconnected evils that required fundamental restructuring of the economy and foreign policy. But the Martin Luther King that America chose to remember was the earlier version, the one who seemed to ask only for inclusion rather than transformation. Schools were named after me, streets in almost every major city, a national holiday. I became an icon, which meant I became harmless. My actual positions, the ones that had made me dangerous, were quietly forgotten or reframed as products of their time rather than critiques that remain relevant. America realized I was right about segregation. That realization came gradually accelerating after my death. The open defense of racial separation became socially unacceptable. Politicians who had fought integration began claiming they had always supported equality. History textbooks were rewritten to make the civil rights movement seem inevitable rather than contested. The overt racism I had fought became embarrassing to Americans who wanted to believe their nation had always been fundamentally decent. But this realization was selective and incomplete. America accepted that legal segregation was wrong. It did not accept that the economic and social structures that made segregation possible remain largely intact. It did not accept that integration of lunch counters and schools, real as it was, had not addressed the fundamental inequality that kept most Black Americans poor and powerless. The statistics told the story. 40 years after my death, the wealth gap between Black and white families had barely changed. Black unemployment remained roughly twice white unemployment. School segregation had returned in many cities as white families moved to suburbs and private schools. The criminal justice system imprisoned Black men at rates that would have seemed impossible in my lifetime. And all of this happened while America celebrated me as a hero, while politicians of both parties quoted my speeches, while the nation congratulated itself on having overcome racism. This was perhaps the deepest irony. America claimed to have accepted my message while rejecting its implications. It honored me precisely by defanging the critique I had been developing when I died. The Martin Luther King celebrated in textbooks and holiday speeches was the one who dreamed of children holding hands, not the one who argued that America was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, not the one who said that a society that spends more on military defense than on social programs is approaching spiritual death. But something else happened too, something more subtle and more significant. The moral framework I had articulated became the language of American self-understanding. Even people who rejected my conclusions accepted my premise that racism was wrong, that equality was right, that judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin was the proper standard. This was not nothing. The America I was born into did not even pretend to believe in racial equality. It openly defended segregation as natural, necessary, even beneficial. By the time of my death, that defense was crumbling. 50 years later, it was gone. No mainstream politician could openly advocate for racial discrimination. No respectable institution could explicitly endorse inequality. The moral ground had shifted. That shift did not produce the results I had hoped for. America learned to oppose racism in language while maintaining it in practice. but the language mattered. It created standards that could be appealed to, contradictions that could be exposed, a moral framework that made hypocrisy visible in ways it had not been before. Young activists who came after me used that framework. They pointed out the gap between America's stated commitment to equality and its actual policies. They documented how housing discrimination persisted through redlining and zoning laws. They showed how school funding formulas perpetuated educational inequality. They demonstrated that criminal justice reform was necessary, not despite America's commitment to equality, but because of it. This was different from what I had done. I had argued that America should live up to its ideals. They argued that America's actual behavior revealed what its real ideals were, that a nation was defined not by its rhetoric, but by its resource allocation, not by what it said, but by what it did. This was a more sophisticated critique than mine had been, less trusting of American goodwill, more focused on structural analysis than moral appeal. I would have learned from them. In my final years, I was moving toward this kind of analysis. I was beginning to see that moral witness, while necessary, was not sufficient, that the problem was not just individual prejudice, but systemic exploitation. That changing laws without changing power relations was like treating symptoms while leaving the disease untouched. But I did not live long enough to fully develop that analysis. What I left behind was incomplete, a movement transitioning from one phase to another, a critique that was becoming more radical just as I was becoming more famous. My death froze me at that moment of transition, making me easier to sanitize, easier to celebrate, easier to claim as a unifying figure even by people who opposed everything I actually stood for. The moment America realized I was right about segregation was not a single moment. It was a process that took decades, that happened unevenly across regions and institutions, that remains incomplete in many ways. The deeper realization that economic inequality and racial inequality are inseparable, that you cannot achieve the dream without addressing the material conditions that make it impossible, that realization has barely begun. I see this most clearly in how different groups claim my legacy. Conservatives quote me to oppose affirmative action, arguing that I believed in colorblind meritocracy. Liberals quote me to support incremental reform, arguing that I believed in working within the system. Radicals quote me to justify more confrontational tactics, pointing to my critiques of capitalism and militarism. All of them are partly right and mostly wrong. I believed in many things that seem contradictory now. I believed in nonviolence, but recognized that passive acceptance of injustice was worse than violent resistance. I believed in America's capacity for change, but saw that change came only through crisis and disruption. I believed in moral witness, but knew that morality without power accomplished nothing. I believed in integration, but was moving toward a critique of the economic system that integration left untouched. The leather Bible I carried, worn and marked with years of notes, represented the foundation of my work. I genuinely believed that loving one's enemies was a spiritual and practical imperative, that nonviolence was not just a tactic but a way of life, that the moral universe bent toward justice. I also believe that loving enemies did not mean accepting their oppression, that nonviolence required confrontation rather than passivity, that the arc of the moral universe bent toward justice only when people grabbed hold of it and pulled. These tensions were never fully resolved in my lifetime. They remain unresolved now. The movement I helped lead achieved important victories and left enormous work undone. America accepted some of what I said and rejected the parts that would have required real sacrifice. I became a hero by becoming safe, by being remembered for the parts of my message that fit comfortably within the existing order. But the uncomfortable parts remain. The questions I was asking when I died about poverty and war and economic justice, those questions did not go away just because America chose to remember me differently than I was. They persist in the statistics of inequality and the realities of who has and who does not, in the gap between America's rhetoric about opportunity and the actual life chances of children born into different circumstances. America realized I was right when doing so became easier than denying it, when the moral cost of defending segregation exceeded the practical cost of ending it, when honoring me required less change than opposing me had. That realization was real but limited, genuine but incomplete, meaningful but insufficient. The deeper realization, the one that would require not just legal reform but economic transformation, that one still waits. It waits in the understanding that racism and capitalism are intertwined, that you cannot end one without addressing the other, that the dream of equality requires more than access to the existing system. It requires changing the system itself. I did not know if that realization would ever come. I hoped for it. I worked toward it. I died before seeing it. The question of when America truly realizes I was right, not just about segregation, but about the deeper structural violence of inequality, that question remains open. The answer will determine whether I am remembered as a prophet of transformation or just another voice calling for reforms that left the fundamental injustice untouched. What I learned in the end was that being right is a beginning, not an ending. I spent 13 years in public life as a civil rights leader, 13 years of speeches and marches and jail cells and death threats, 13 years of watching America resist truths it claimed to believe, then slowly, grudgingly, partially accept them. 13 years of discovering that moral clarity does not automatically translate into political power, that justice delayed is not just justice denied, but justice actively opposed by people who benefit from delay. The question of when America realized I was right has no single answer because America itself is not a single thing. It is millions of people with different interests, different fears, different capacities for moral imagination. Some realized immediately that segregation was wrong. They had always known. Others fought that realization until their deaths. Most fell somewhere between, capable of acknowledging injustice in principle while finding endless reasons why addressing it should wait. What changed was not mass moral conversion. What changed was the political and social cost of maintaining segregation. We made that cost visible. We forced America to see what it had been content to ignore. We created situations where the brutality required to maintain the old order was broadcast into living rooms across the nation. We made respectable people uncomfortable with their complicity. This was not the victory I had imagined when I started. I had believed in moral persuasion, in appealing to conscience, in trusting that Americans who saw injustice clearly would demand change. I learned that seeing injustice and demanding change are very different things. People can witness terrible things and still find reasons why the solution is too expensive, too disruptive, too dangerous, too fast. The civil rights legislation we won was real. It mattered enormously. Black children could attend schools their parents could not have entered. Black families could live in neighborhoods that had been closed to them. Black workers could apply for jobs from which they had been excluded. These were not small victories. They changed millions of lives. But they did not change the deeper structure of inequality. 50 years after my death, most black children still attended underfunded schools. Most black families still had a fraction of the wealth of white families. Most black workers still face discrimination, just less overt than before. The law said one thing. The reality remains stubbornly resistant to legal change. This is what I was beginning to understand in my final years. You can legislate behavior, you cannot legislate results. Ending legal segregation did not end residential segregation. Banning employment discrimination did not create equal opportunity. Guaranteeing voting rights did not produce equal political power. The formal barriers came down, but the substantive inequality remained protected now, not by law, but by market forces, social networks, accumulated advantage, and the thousand ways that power perpetuates itself. I did not have a solution to this problem. I knew that economic redistribution was necessary. I knew that America would have to choose between its commitment to equality and its tolerance for vast wealth disparities. I knew that meaningful change required more than civil rights legislation. It required what I started calling a revolution of values, a fundamental reordering of priorities away from profit and toward people. But I also knew that this was much harder than anything we had achieved. You can force restaurants to serve black customers by making the alternative legally risky and economically costly. You cannot force businesses to pay higher wages or wealthy people to accept higher taxes the same way. Those things require either government action that most Americans oppose or moral transformation that I had seen no evidence was coming. So I died uncertain, certain that I had been right about segregation, uncertain whether America would ever accept the deeper implications of that rightness, certain that we had achieved important victories, uncertain whether those victories would lead to real equality or just to a more sophisticated form of inequality. The artifact that outlasted me was not the leather Bible, though that remains symbolically important. It was the moral language I had helped make central to American political discourse. The idea that racism was wrong, that equality was right, that discrimination should be opposed, these became accepted principles. Not universally, not even consistently, but widely enough that they could not be easily dismissed. That language created tools for future activists. They could point to the gap between stated principles and actual practice. They could demand that America live up to the standards it claimed to hold. They could use my words and the words of the movement I helped lead to argue for changes I had not lived to see. But they also had to contend with how that language was deployed against them. The same rhetoric of colorblindness and equality that we had used to attack segregation was turned into an argument against remedies for inequality. The dream of a society where people were judged by the content of their character was invoked to oppose policies designed to address the ongoing effects of centuries of discrimination. This was frustrating but not surprising. Language is always contested. The powerful always try to use the language of justice to defend injustice. What matters is not controlling the rhetoric, but demonstrating its contradictions, showing how America's stated commitments conflict with its actual choices. I see now, looking back across the years since my death, that America realized I was right about segregation, not when it changed its laws, but when it changed what was socially acceptable to say. The shift from open defense of racial hierarchy to public commitment to equality, even if that commitment remained more rhetorical than real, was significant. It meant that arguments had to be made differently, that injustice had to be justified in race-neutral terms, that discrimination had to hide behind supposedly neutral policies rather than being openly embraced. This made the fight harder in some ways. Overt enemies are easier to identify than systemic processes. Bull Connor with his fire hoses was a clearer target than lending practices that produce racially disparate outcomes without explicit racial intent. But it also created opportunities. Every claim of colorblindness could be tested against actual results. Every assertion of equal opportunity could be measured against actual outcomes. The gap between rhetoric and reality became a tool for demanding change. The realization I wanted, the one where America genuinely committed to equality and accepted what that would require, that realization has not come. What came instead was partial acceptance, selective memory, and the transformation of a radical critique into an acceptable narrative. I became safe enough to honor precisely because the most challenging parts of my message were forgotten or reinterpreted into harmlessness. But something did change. Not everything I hoped for, not as much as was needed, but the America I was born into and the America that exists now are different in ways that matter. My children grew up in a world where legal segregation was illegal rather than required. They had opportunities I did not have. They faced different obstacles, ongoing racism expressed through different mechanisms, but they did not face the same explicit, legally sanctioned, universally accepted racial hierarchy that I faced. That is something. It is not enough. It is not what I died for, but it is not nothing either. The question of when America realized I was right turns out to be the wrong question. The better question is what parts of my message America was willing to accept and what parts it continues to resist. America accepted that overt racial discrimination is wrong. It has not accepted that addressing the ongoing effects of that discrimination requires significant sacrifice from those who have benefited from it. America accepted the dream of equality. It has not accepted the economic restructuring that would make that dream possible. I was right about what needed to change. I was too optimistic about whether change would come, too trusting of America's moral capacity, too confident that exposing injustice would automatically lead to its correction. I believe that the arc of the moral universe bent toward justice. I still believe that, but I learned that it bends slowly, reluctantly, only when pulled by people willing to sacrifice for something they may not live to see. The work I started remains unfinished. It will always remain unfinished because justice is not a destination but a direction, not a final state but an ongoing struggle. Each generation has to choose whether to continue that struggle or to settle for whatever partial gains have been achieved. I hope they continue. I hope they learn from my successes and my failures. I hope they are more realistic about human nature than I was, less surprised by resistance, less wounded by betrayal. I hope they are also more ambitious than I was, less willing to settle for legal changes that leave substantive inequality intact, less satisfied with rhetoric that substitutes for reality. Most of all, I hope they understand that being right is never enough, that truth without power is impotent, that morality without strategy is self-indulgent, that outrage without organization accomplishes nothing. I learned these lessons slowly and incompletely. Perhaps they can learn them faster. The moment America realized I was right was the moment it became easier to agree with me than to oppose me. The moment the cost of maintaining the old order exceeded the cost of changing it. The moment denying obvious truth became more embarrassing than admitting it. That moment came for segregation. It has not come for economic justice. It may never come. But the attempt matters. The struggle itself has dignity. The refusal to accept injustice, even when changing it seems impossible, that refusal is its own kind of victory. Not the victory I wanted, not the one I died for, but the one I actually achieved. I was right. America realized it slowly, partially, reluctantly. That realization changed laws and norms and possibilities. It did not change everything. It did not create the beloved community I envisioned. It did not bend the arc of the moral universe as far as it needed to bend. But it bent it some. And that in the end is what being right accomplishes. Not transformation, not conversion, just movement. Small, costly, insufficient movement in the direction of justice. Enough to matter, never enough to finish, always enough to continue. That is the truth I learned. That is what I hope you understand. Being right is the beginning of the work, not the end of it. The realization comes slowly. The struggle continues. And that continuation, that refusal to stop even when progress is painful and partial and incomplete, that is where meaning lives.